Idaho winters had always been merciless, but the winter of 1913 seemed to harbor a particular malevolence. The Willows family had moved to Boise from Chicago the previous spring, drawn by promises of land and prosperity in the growing western city. Thomas Willows, a former accountant turned shopkeeper, had purchased a modest two-story home on the outskirts of town, where the city began to dissolve into farmland and wilderness. On this particular evening in late January, a blizzard had knocked out the electricity that had only recently been installed in their neighborhood. The Willows family, Thomas, his wife Eleanor, and their three children, James, 15, Catherine, 12, and little Sarah, 7, gathered around the dining table by candlelight, something that had become increasingly common as winter storms ravaged the power lines. "This reminds me of the stories my grandmother used to tell," Eleanor said softly, as she served a simple dinner of stew and bread. "She always said candlelight brings the past and present together." Thomas smiled weakly. The move to Boise hadn't been as prosperous as he'd hoped. His small general store struggled against more established businesses, and the harsh winter had only made matters worse. Still, he maintained a brave face for his family. "When I was a boy," Thomas began, attempting to lighten the mood, "we'd gather around just like this and tell ghost stories on nights when the wind howled." "Tell us one, Father," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Thomas chuckled. "Perhaps something mild. I wouldn't want to frighten you all before bedtime." "I'm not scared," James said with teenage bravado, though he pulled his chair a little closer to the table. As Thomas began a benign tale about lost travelers finding shelter in an abandoned house, Catherine's attention drifted to the candle at the center of the table. Its flame danced erratically, casting long shadows across the room despite the absence of any draught. She stared into it, mesmerized by its movements, so different from the steady electric lights they had become accustomed to. "Catherine," her mother's voice seemed distant. "Catherine, are you listening to your father's story?" But Catherine couldn't pull her gaze from the flame. As she stared, the yellow-orange flicker began to take shape. Not just random patterns, but something more deliberate. Within the heart of the flame, she could swear she saw a face forming, its features contorted in anguish. "Do you see that?" she whispered, interrupting her father's tale. "See what, dear?" Eleanor asked, following her daughter's gaze to the candle. "In the flame. There's a face." The family fell silent, all eyes turning to the candle. For a moment nobody spoke. "I don't see anything unusual," Thomas finally said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. "I see it!" Sarah suddenly cried out. "It's looking at us!" Thomas reached forward to extinguish the candle, but before his fingers could pinch the wick, the flame surged upward with a sharp hiss. Everyone flinched backward, and in that moment, Catherine could have sworn she heard a faint scream emanating from the fire itself, a sound both distant and impossibly close. The flame settled back to its normal size, and Thomas laughed nervously. "Just a pocket of air in the wax, nothing more. Now, where was I in my story?" The evening continued, but Catherine noticed her parents exchanging worried glances throughout dinner. When they finished eating, her mother was quick to usher the children upstairs to bed, despite their protests that it was earlier than usual. As Catherine lay in the darkness of the room she shared with Sarah, she could hear her parents talking in hushed, urgent tones downstairs. She couldn't make out the words, but the anxiety in their voices was unmistakable. "Kathy," Sarah's small voice came from the adjacent bed. "Did you really see a face in the candle?" Catherine hesitated. I think so. Did you?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "And it looked like the man in the photograph." Catherine sat up, suddenly alert. "What photograph?" "The one I found in the attic when we were playing hide-and-seek last week. It was in an old box, a man with a beard and scary eyes." A chill ran down Catherine's spine. They had been strictly forbidden from exploring the attic since moving in. Their father had claimed it was unsafe, with loose floorboards and exposed nails. "Sarah, we shouldn't have been in the attic," Catherine scolded, though her curiosity was piqued. "What did you do with the photograph?" "I put it back. I was scared of it." His eyes followed me. Catherine lay back down, pulling the quilt tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth from the coal stove in the corner of their room. She tried to dismiss her sister's words as childish imagination, but the image of the face in the flame remained vivid in her mind. As she drifted towards sleep, a soft crackling sound caught her attention. Opening her eyes, she saw a small candle on their dresser, one that hadn't been lit when they went to bed. Its flame was tall and unnaturally still, and in its depths, unmistakable this time, was a face, not in pain as she had first thought, but twisted in rage. The mouth opened in a silent scream, and suddenly Catherine found she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't call out to Sarah. From downstairs came the sound of shattering glass, followed by her mother's startled cry. The candle on the dresser extinguished itself, plunging the room back into darkness. Catherine gasped as the paralysis left her body, and she scrambled from her bed to Sarah's, clutching her confused sister tightly. "What's happening?" Sarah whimpered. "I don't know," Catherine whispered back, straining to hear what was happening downstairs. Her father's heavy footsteps crossed the floor below, and the front door opened and closed. Minutes passed in tense silence before they heard their parents climbing the stairs. The door to their bedroom opened, and their mother appeared, her face pale in the light of the lantern she carried. "Everything's all right, girls," Eleanor said with forced cheerfulness. "Just a branch that broke through the kitchen window. Your father has patched it up for now." But Catherine could see the lie in her mother's eyes, and when Eleanor set the lantern down on the dresser, Catherine noticed her hands were shaking. "Try to get some sleep now," Eleanor said, kissing each girl on the forehead before leaving the room. Neither Catherine nor Sarah slept much that night. They lay awake, listening to the wind howling outside and the strange creaking of the house. Sounds that had never seemed threatening before, but now carried an undercurrent of malice. The next morning, Catherine woke to find Sarah already up and standing at their bedroom window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. "There are footprints," Sarah said simply when she noticed Catherine was awake. Catherine joined her at the window. Indeed, there was a single set of footprints leading from their front porch into the yard, then disappearing at the edge of the property where the woods began. They were large prints, a man's, and they only went in one direction, away from the house. "Father must have gone out to check something," Catherine reasoned, though doubt gnawed at her. When they went downstairs for breakfast, they found their mother cooking in silence, her movements mechanical. The kitchen window was indeed broken, covered with a piece of wood nailed over the frame. Their father was nowhere to be seen. "Where's father?" James asked, voicing the question on all their minds. "He had to go into town early," Eleanor replied without turning from the stove. "Some urgent business at the store." But Catherine noticed her mother's red-rimmed eyes and the way she avoided looking directly at any of them. And when breakfast was served, their father's absence felt like a gaping wound at the table. That afternoon, as Catherine helped her mother with the mending, she finally gathered the courage to ask, "Mother, what really happened last night?" Eleanor's hands stilled, the needle poised mid-stitch. For a long moment she said nothing, and Catherine thought she would refuse to answer. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "There are things about this house I wish we had known before we moved in." "What things?" Eleanor set aside her sewing and looked at Catherine with an expression that made the girl feel suddenly much older than her 12 years. "The previous owner, Mr. Everson, was not a good man. They say he did terrible things before he died." "Died? How?" "They found him in the attic. They said it was suicide, but—" Eleanor trailed off, then shook her head. "These are not matters for children. Your father has gone to speak with someone who might know more about the history of this place. He'll be back soon." But Thomas didn't return that day, or the next. On the third day, the local sheriff came to their door, his hat in his hands and a grave expression on his weathered face. They had found Thomas's wagon abandoned on the road to town. The horse still hitched, but no sign of Thomas himself. A search party had been organized, but the fresh snowfall had covered any tracks that might have led them to him. As the sheriff spoke with Eleanor in hushed tones in the parlor, Catherine slipped away and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. She needed to see the photograph Sarah had mentioned, needed to know if the face she had seen in the flame belonged to the previous owner of their home. The attic was cold and dim, with only a small window at each end, providing meager light. Dust motes danced in the pale beams that cut through the gloom. Catherine moved carefully across the creaking floorboards, searching for the box Sarah had described. She found it tucked beneath the eaves, an old steamer trunk with tarnished brass fittings. It wasn't locked, and the lid opened with a protesting groan. Inside were the personal effects of a life: clothes, books, letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small stack of photographs. Catherine's hands trembled as she lifted the photos, examining each one until she found what she was looking for. The man in the photograph had a full beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through the sepia tones of the image. He stood stiffly in front of the very house they now occupied, his expression severe. But it wasn't his stern countenance that made Catherine's blood run cold. It was the unmistakable resemblance to the face she had seen in the candle flame. As she stared at the photograph, a sharp gust of wind blew through the attic, ruffling the papers around her and carrying with it a whisper that seemed to form words. "Found you." Catherine dropped the photograph and ran for the attic stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the door, it slammed shut before her, the latch falling into place with a decisive click. She was trapped. Catherine pounded on the attic door, calling for help, but her voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence of the space. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, she heard footsteps on the stairs, and her mother's voice called out, "Catherine, are you up there?" The latch lifted, and the door swung open to reveal Eleanor's worried face. "What are you doing in the attic? I've told you children it's not safe up here." Catherine flew into her mother's arms. "I found his picture," she sobbed. "The man Sarah saw in the candle. He's real, Mother. He was the owner before us." Eleanor stiffened, then gently pushed Catherine toward the stairs. "Come down now. The sheriff is still here, and he'll think it's strange if we're both missing." Once they were back on the second-floor landing, Eleanor knelt to Catherine's level, her hands gripping her daughter's shoulders firmly. "Listen to me carefully. You are not to speak of any of this to the sheriff. Not about the candles, not about the photograph, not about anything unusual. Do you understand? But what about Father? What if it has something to do with where he's gone?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. "That's exactly why we must keep silent. The people in town already think we're outsiders. If we start talking about things that can't be explained, they'll never take the search for your father seriously." Catherine wanted to argue, but the desperation in her mother's eyes silenced her. She nodded reluctantly. Downstairs, the sheriff was preparing to leave. He tipped his hat to Eleanor and promised to return with any news of Thomas. As he stepped onto the porch, he paused and turned back. "Mrs. Willows, I don't mean to pry, but the folks in town have been talking. Did your husband ever mention any disagreements with anyone locally? Any business troubles or the like?" Eleanor's face remained impassive. "No, Sheriff. Thomas kept mostly to himself. His business was struggling a bit with the winter weather, but nothing that would cause trouble." The sheriff nodded slowly. "And had he been acting strangely at all before he disappeared?" Catherine felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder. "Not at all," Eleanor replied evenly. "He was his usual self." After the sheriff left, Eleanor gathered all three children in the parlor. Her face was drawn with worry, but her voice was steady as she addressed them. "Until your father returns, we must be very careful. James, you'll have to help me run the store. Catherine, you'll be in charge of the house when I'm not here. And Sarah," she smiled gently at her youngest, "you'll need to be brave and help your sister." "When is father coming back?" Sarah asked, her small voice quavering. Eleanor hesitated. "Soon, I hope. But until then, there are rules we must follow. No one goes into the attic. No candles are to be lit unless absolutely necessary, and never left unattended, and no one is to be alone in the house. We stay together." That night, Eleanor moved all 3 children into the master bedroom with her. They pushed furniture against the door and windows, claiming it was to keep out the cold, but Catherine knew better. Her mother was afraid, not just for Thomas, but of something in their own home. As they settled into their makeshift beds, Eleanor told cheerful stories from her childhood, clearly attempting to distract them from their fears. But when she thought the children were asleep, Catherine watched through half-closed eyes as her mother pulled something from beneath her pillow, a small leather-bound book. Eleanor read by the light of a single candle, carefully positioned so that the flame was not directly visible to anyone lying down. Catherine could see her mother's lips moving silently as she read, occasionally pausing to make notes on a separate piece of paper. Just as Catherine was finally drifting to sleep, she heard her mother gasp. Fully alert again, she saw Eleanor staring into the candle flame, her face drained of color. Then, with a quick movement, Eleanor pinched out the flame and sat in the darkness, her breathing ragged. The next day, James and Eleanor left for the store, leaving Catherine and Sarah at home with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone but the sheriff or their neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived half a mile down the road. The day passed uneventfully, with Catherine keeping Sarah occupied with games and chores. But as dusk approached and Eleanor and James had not yet returned, Catherine began to worry. "They should have been back by now," she murmured, peering out the front window at the darkening road. "Maybe they had customers," Sarah suggested, though she too kept glancing anxiously at the door. By the time full darkness had fallen, Catherine had made a decision. "We need to go to the Hendersons." Mother said not to be alone in the house after dark. They bundled up against the cold, and Catherine lit a lantern to guide their way. The snow had stopped, but the night was bitterly cold, and their breath formed clouds in the still air as they stepped onto the porch. Catherine was locking the front door when Sarah tugged urgently at her coat. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the edge of their property. A figure stood at the tree line, partially obscured by shadows. It was tall and motionless, watching the house. "Hello," Catherine called, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond or move. "It's him," Sarah whimpered, "the man from the photograph." Catherine held the lantern higher, trying to see more clearly, but the light didn't reach that far. "We need to go now," she said, gripping Sarah's hand tightly. They hurried down the porch steps and onto the road, not daring to look back until they had put some distance between themselves and the house. When Catherine finally glanced over her shoulder, the figure was gone. The Hendersons welcomed them warmly, expressing concern when they learned Eleanor and James had not returned from town. Mr. Henderson immediately set out to check on them, while Mrs. Henderson fed the girls hot soup and tried to ease their fears with cheerful conversation. When Mr. Henderson returned 2 hours later, his grave expression told them something was wrong before he even spoke. The store was locked up, no sign of them, he reported to his wife in a low voice that Catherine nevertheless overheard. "I checked with the sheriff. There's been no word about Thomas, and now Eleanor and the boy are missing too." That night, Catherine and Sarah slept in the Hendersons' spare room, but Catherine found little rest. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. By morning, she had made a decision. She needed to return to their house and find the book her mother had been reading. Whatever was happening to her family, the answers seemed to be there. Despite the Hendersons' objections, Catherine insisted on retrieving some clothes from home. Mrs. Henderson reluctantly agreed to accompany them, but made them promise to be quick. The house stood silent and cold in the morning light, showing no signs of Eleanor and James's return. While Mrs. Henderson helped Sarah gather some clothing. Catherine slipped into the master bedroom and searched frantically for the book she had seen her mother reading. She found it tucked between the mattress and headboard, a journal with the name Edward Everson embossed on the cover. Quickly she stuffed it into her coat pocket along with the notes her mother had made. As they were leaving, Catherine noticed something she had missed upon entering. A single set of muddy footprints leading from the front door to the stairs, then up toward the attic. They were fresh, the snow and dirt still wet. "Mrs. Henderson," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Did you go upstairs when we arrived?" "No, dear. I've been with Sarah the whole time," the woman replied, coming to stand beside Catherine. She frowned at the footprints. "That's strange. Are you sure no one else has been here?" "The door was locked when we arrived," Catherine said, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. Mrs. Henderson's face paled. "We should go. Now." They hurried from the house, and as Catherine looked back from the road, she thought she saw a face watching from the attic window. A bearded face with deep-set eyes that seemed to follow their retreat. Back at the Hendersons, while Sarah was being entertained by Mrs. Henderson, Catherine secreted herself in the spare room and opened Edward Everson's journal with trembling hands. The journal began as a mundane account of a man's life in Boise, his business dealings, his observations on the growing city. But as Catherine read on, the entries became increasingly disturbed. Everson wrote of hearing voices in the night, of seeing faces in mirrors and flames that weren't his own. He became convinced that his house, their house, was built on land that had once been sacred to the indigenous people of the area, land that had been desecrated by the early settlers. The final entries were almost incoherent, filled with ravings about a presence that had taken residence in his home, a malevolent spirit that demanded a blood sacrifice to be appeased. The last entry, dated just 3 days before Everson's reported suicide, read, "It has shown me what it wants. A family. Souls to replace those that were taken when this land was stolen. I cannot give it what it desires. I have no family of my own, but I have found another way. I will give it myself instead." Catherine's hands shook as she set down the journal. Her mother's notes, scribbled in the margins of a torn piece of paper, filled in more of the story. Eleanor had discovered that before Everson's death, he had attempted to sell the house to a family with 3 children, a family much like their own. That family had backed out of the sale at the last minute, claiming they had experienced frightening phenomena during their final walk-through of the property. 3 weeks later, Everson was found hanging in the attic. The property had remained vacant for nearly a year before the Willows purchased it, the price drastically reduced due to its grim history. Catherine's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion downstairs. She heard Mr. Henderson's voice raised in surprise, then hurried footsteps on the stairs. The door to the spare room burst open, and there stood James, his face pale and his clothes disheveled. "James!" Catherine cried, running to embrace her brother. "What happened? Where's Mother?" James's eyes were wide with shock. "She's still there, at the house, with Father. Father, he's back." Catherine felt a surge of hope that quickly died as she saw the expression on her brother's face. "Not back," James whispered. "He never left. He's been in the attic all along." Catherine's mind reeled as she tried to process James's words. "What do you mean, in the attic? How is that possible? The sheriff said his wagon was found on the road to town." James shook his head, his eyes haunted. "I don't know about any wagon. All I know is what I saw. Mother and I were closing up the store yesterday when Mr. Peterson came in. He said he'd seen a light in our attic window the night before. Said he thought it strange, since everyone knew we were staying in town with the sheriff's family while they searched for Father." James paused, shivering despite the warmth of the room. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway with a blanket, which she draped around his shoulders before ushering Sarah away, clearly sensing this was not a conversation for a 7-year-old's ears. Mother went pale when she heard that. James continued once Mrs. Henderson had left. She insisted we return home immediately, even though it was almost dark. When we got there, the house was cold and dark, just as we'd left it. But Mother, she went straight to the attic. I tried to stop her, told her about the rules she'd set, but she wouldn't listen. And Father was there? Catherine prompted when James fell silent, staring into the middle distance. James's gaze snapped back to her, and the fear in his eyes made Catherine's blood run cold. Not just Father, he was there, yes, but he wasn't alone. There was someone, something, with him, a shadow that moved on its own. And Father, he wasn't himself, Cathy. His eyes were wrong, empty. He spoke, but the voice wasn't his. "What did he say?" Catherine whispered. "He said, 'The family is almost complete.' And then Mother screamed at me to run, to find you and Sarah, to stay away from the house." The attic door slammed shut between us. I could hear her pounding on it, calling for help, but I couldn't get it open. And then I heard Father's voice, his real voice, calling my name from behind me. James was shaking now, tears streaming down his face. I turned, and he was standing at the top of the attic stairs, exactly where I had just seen him on the other side of the door. But this time he looked afraid. He told me to run, that it wasn't safe, that the house wanted us all. So I ran all the way to town, but the sheriff was out with a search party. I spent the night hiding in the store, and as soon as it was light, I came here, hoping you and Sarah would be safe. Catherine pulled the journal from her pocket. "I found this. It belonged to the previous owner, Edward Everson. Mother was reading it the night before you both disappeared." She quickly explained what she had learned from the journal and Eleanor's notes. Everson thought the house, or something in it, wanted a family, a sacrifice to appease whatever was disturbed when the land was settled. James's eyes widened. That's what Father said. What the thing pretending to be Father said. The family is almost complete. "It has Mother and Father now," Catherine said, a chill running through her. "And it wants us too." For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Then Catherine straightened her shoulders, a determined look crossing her face. "We have to go back. We have to help them." "Are you mad?" James exclaimed. "Didn't you hear what I said? The house wants us, all of us." "Exactly," Catherine replied. "It won't harm Mother and Father until it has us too. That gives us time, and maybe there's a way to stop it." She flipped through Everson's journal again, scanning the pages for anything that might help them. Near the end, almost lost amid the man's increasingly frantic scribbling, was a passage that caught her eye. "Fire cleanses, fire releases. The binding flame that holds the spirit to this place can also set it free, but it must be willingly offered, freely given." "What does that mean?" James asked, reading over her shoulder. "I'm not sure," Catherine admitted. "But Everson wrote about faces in flames, and we saw them too, in the candles. Maybe fire is important somehow." Before they could discuss it further, Sarah burst into the room, her face alight with excitement. "James, you're back! Is Mother with you? Is Father home?" The siblings exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to shield their sister from the full truth. "Not yet," Catherine said gently, "but we're going to go help them." "I want to come too," Sarah insisted. "No," James said firmly. "You need to stay here with the Hendersons where it's safe." But convincing Sarah proved impossible. She clung to them, crying that she didn't want to be left alone, that she wanted to see Mother and Father. In the end, unable to explain the danger without frightening her even more, they reluctantly agreed she could come, but she would have to stay with Mr. Henderson, who insisted on accompanying them despite their protests. As they approached their house in the fading afternoon light, Catherine felt a sense of dread building in her chest. The place looked ordinary enough, a simple two-story home with smoke curling from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside, but she could almost feel a malevolent awareness watching their approach. "The smoke," James murmured. "Someone's lit a fire." "Your mother must be home," Mr. Henderson said, his relief evident. "Thank goodness." But Catherine and James exchanged worried glances. They knew it might not be their mother who had lit that fire, or at least not their mother acting of her own free will. Mr. Henderson insisted on entering first, with Sarah held firmly by the hand. Catherine and James followed close behind, both alert for any sign of danger. The house was warm and oddly welcoming after the bitter cold outside. A fire blazed in the parlor hearth, and the smell of something cooking wafted from the kitchen. It all seemed so normal that Catherine almost wondered if James had imagined the whole incident in the attic. "Eleanor?" Mr. Henderson called. "Thomas? Are you home?" "In the kitchen," came Eleanor's voice, sounding perfectly ordinary. They found her at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She turned as they entered, her face breaking into a smile at the sight of them. "James, Catherine, Sarah, you're all here, and Mr. Henderson too. How lovely!" But something was wrong. Eleanor's movements were too precise, her smile too fixed, and her eyes. Catherine suppressed a shudder. Her mother's eyes held the same emptiness James had described seeing in their father's. "Where's Thomas?" Mr. Henderson asked, seemingly oblivious to the strangeness of Eleanor's demeanor. "Upstairs," Eleanor replied, still smiling that unnatural smile. "Preparing the attic." "Preparing it for what?" Mr. Henderson asked. "For the binding," Eleanor said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We'll all be together soon. Forever." Mr. Henderson frowned, clearly confused, but before he could question further, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Catherine had to stifle a gasp. Like Eleanor, he appeared normal at first glance, but there was something profoundly wrong in his vacant stare and mechanical movements. "You've brought them home," he said, his voice flat. "Good, we can begin." Mr. Henderson stepped forward, positioning himself between Thomas and the children. "Begin what, Thomas? What's going on here? You two have had the whole town worried sick." Thomas tilted his head slightly, regarding Mr. Henderson with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity. "You weren't invited." "Now see here," Mr. Henderson began, but he never finished the sentence. Thomas moved with unnatural speed, crossing the kitchen in a blur and seizing Mr. Henderson by the throat. With strength no ordinary man should possess, he lifted the struggling farmer off his feet. Sarah screamed and James lunged forward to help, but Eleanor intercepted him, her deceptively delicate hands clamping around his arms with bruising force. "Run!" James shouted to Catherine and Sarah. "Get out now!" Catherine grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted for the front door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. Every window they passed did the same, shutters banging closed as if moved by invisible hands. They were trapped. From the kitchen came a sickening thud, followed by silence. Moments later, Thomas appeared in the parlor, dragging an unconscious Mr. Henderson by the collar of his coat. "He'll wake soon," Thomas said in that same emotionless voice. "We'll deal with him then. But first, the children must be prepared." Eleanor appeared behind him, still gripping a struggling James. "The attic is ready," she said. "The binding flame is lit." As they advanced on Catherine and Sarah, Catherine's mind raced frantically. The binding flame. Fire cleanses, fire releases. Could that be the key? "Wait!" she cried. "I know what you want. You want us to join you, to be bound to this house forever." Thomas and Eleanor stopped, their empty eyes fixed on her. "But it has to be willingly offered, freely given," Catherine continued, remembering the words from Everson's journal. "You can't force us. It won't work." Something flickered in Thomas's expression, uncertainty, perhaps, or anger. "The girl is right," came a new voice, raspy and cold, emanating from Thomas's mouth, yet clearly not his own. "The sacrifice must be willing, but children are easily persuaded." Catherine backed away, pushing Sarah behind her. "What are you? Why are you doing this?" A smile spread across Thomas's face, but it was not her father's smile. "I am what remains, what was left behind when they slaughtered my people and took our sacred ground. This house stands where our holy fire once burned, a fire that connected us to the spirit world, Now I am trapped between worlds, neither living nor dead. And you need us to... To what? Keep you company? Catherine asked, trying to keep the entity talking while she frantically sought a way out. To feed me, the voice said simply. Your life force, your souls, bound to this place as I am bound. Everson was to bring me a family, but he failed. He thought his own life would be enough, but one soul cannot sustain me for long. Now I have your parents, but I need more. I need the children. As the creature spoke, Catherine noticed something. When it was focused on her, its control over her parents seemed to weaken slightly. Eleanor's grip on James had loosened, and there was a flicker of awareness in Thomas's eyes, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably there. James, Catherine said carefully, not looking directly at her brother. The binding flame. It's in the attic. James gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding dawning in his eyes. We'll go with you, Catherine said to the entity. Willingly. But first, release our parents. Show us you can do that, and we'll offer ourselves freely. The thing wearing her father's face laughed, a hollow sound that echoed strangely in the parlor. Clever child. But I cannot release what is already bound. Your parents gave themselves to me to protect you, a bargain freely made. Then we'll never agree, Catherine declared. You'll have to take us by force, and you said yourself that won't work. Oh, the entity snarled, a sound no human throat should be able to produce. Thomas's body lunged forward, hands outstretched toward Catherine's throat. Now, James, Catherine shouted. James wrenched free from Eleanor's slackened grip and bolted for the stairs. Thomas immediately changed course, pursuing him with inhuman speed. Sarah, stay here! Catherine commanded, then ran after them, praying her brother could reach the attic before their father, or whatever was controlling him, caught up. She heard James's footsteps pounding up the second flight of stairs to the attic, followed by the heavier tread of Thomas. By the time Catherine reached the second floor, she could hear a struggle above her. Heart pounding, she raced up the attic stairs. The scene that met her eyes would stay with her forever. The attic was transformed, the mundane storage space now arranged like some primitive altar. Candles burned at compass points around a central fire pit dug into the wooden floor, a gaping hole that should have set the whole house ablaze, but somehow contained its flames. James was wrestling with Thomas near this pit, both dangerously close to falling in. But what froze Catherine's blood was the sight of 4 figures standing rigidly at the cardinal points of the room. Eleanor, now somehow upstairs, though Catherine had left her below. Mr. Henderson, conscious but vacant-eyed, and 2 others Catherine had never seen. A man and a woman in outdated clothing, their faces as empty as her parents'. More victims, Catherine realized with horror. The flames from the central pit cast grotesque shadows on the walls, making it seem as if a dozen figures, rather than just 5, occupied the attic space. Catherine stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching as James struggled against their father's unnatural strength. The journal, James gasped, catching sight of Catherine. Burn it, in the binding flame. Catherine clutched Everson's journal, which she'd kept in her coat pocket. The entity, hearing James's words, let out an inhuman shriek and redoubled its efforts to subdue him. No! It howled through Thomas's mouth. The words are part of the binding, the secrets! Understanding dawned on Catherine. Everson hadn't just documented the haunting. His journal had somehow become part of the ritual, a physical anchor for the spirit's presence. With trembling hands, she approached the fire pit, feeling its heat sear her face even from several feet away. "Stop her!" the entity commanded. The 4 figures at the compass points, Eleanor, Mr. Henderson, and the 2 strangers, moved as one, stepping away from their positions and advancing toward Catherine. "Mother, please," Catherine pleaded as Eleanor's vacant form approached. "I know you're still in there. Help us." For a moment, something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Recognition, fear, love, before the emptiness returned. But that moment was enough. Eleanor's step faltered, creating a gap in the advancing line. Catherine darted through, racing toward the fire pit. James, seeing her approach, gave a mighty shove that sent Thomas stumbling backward, buying her precious seconds. "Catherine!" Sarah's voice came from the attic entrance. Despite Catherine's instructions to stay below, the little girl had followed her sister upstairs and now stood wide-eyed at the scene before her. "Sarah, get back!" Catherine shouted, but it was too late. The entity had seen her. "The youngest," it hissed through Thomas's lips, "the purest soul, mine." Thomas's body lurched toward Sarah, hands outstretched. James threw himself at his father's back, clinging desperately to slow him down, but the entity's strength was overwhelming. Catherine had seconds to decide. The journal in her hands might be the key to ending this nightmare, but Sarah was in immediate danger. Without hesitation, she thrust the journal into the binding flame and raced toward her little sister. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The moment the journal touched the flames, they flared blindingly bright, consuming the book with unnatural speed. A howl of rage and pain filled the attic, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas stopped mid-stride, his body going rigid. The same happened to Eleanor and the other two possessed figures. Only Mr. Henderson collapsed to the floor, unconscious once more. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, clinging to Catherine as the attic began to shake, dust and debris raining down from the rafters. "The binding is breaking," Catherine replied, though she was far from certain. "James, come on, we need to get out." James scrambled toward them, but before he could reach the stairs, Thomas's body convulsed violently. His head snapped back, mouth opening in a silent scream, as a dark, roiling mass seemed to pour from his eyes, nose, and mouth. A shadowy essence that hung in the air above him before coalescing into a vaguely human shape. Catherine pulled Sarah behind her, backing slowly toward the stairs. James reached them, positioning himself protectively in front of his sisters. "You think burning words on paper can defeat me?" The voice no longer came from Thomas's mouth, but from the shadowy figure itself, its words like ice in their veins. "I have waited decades in this place. I can wait decades more for another family, another sacrifice." Thomas's body crumpled to the floor beside Eleanor's, both of them now as unconscious as Mr. Henderson and the two strangers. The entity hovered above them, its form shifting and pulsing like smoke in a breeze. "But why wait?" it continued, "when I have 3 young souls right here. Your parents failed to protect you. Their sacrifice was incomplete." The shadow lunged toward them, and the children scrambled backward down the stairs. The temperature in the attic plummeted, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "The fire!" James shouted over the entity's unearthly howling. "The binding flame! We need to extinguish it." Catherine looked back at the pit. The flames still burned bright, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around them. "How? We can't get near it with that thing between us." As if in answer, a weak voice called from behind the shadow entity. "Children!" Thomas had regained consciousness, though he remained on the floor, too weak to stand. His eyes, clear and his own again, fixed on them with desperate intensity. "The blood that lit the flame must extinguish it," he gasped. "My blood lit it when I was under its control. Mine must end it." "No, father!" Catherine cried, understanding what he meant to do. The shadow entity whirled, sensing the threat in Thomas's words. It dove toward him, seeking to repossess the body it had controlled. Thomas used the last of his strength to roll toward the fire pit. Before the entity could reach him, before his children could stop him, he thrust his hand directly into the binding flame. The effect was catastrophic. The moment Thomas's blood, the blood that had been used in the binding ritual, touched the flame, it exploded upward in a column of fire that reached the attic rafters. The shadow entity was caught in the conflagration, its form writhing and dissolving in the supernatural blaze. A scream that seemed to contain 100 voices tore through the attic, and with it came a pressure wave that knocked the children off their feet and sent them tumbling down the attic stairs. Catherine's last glimpse of the attic was of her father, somehow on his feet now, standing tall in the heart of the flame that should have been consuming him, but instead seemed to flow through him. His eyes met hers for one brief moment, filled with love and a profound relief before the attic door slammed shut between them. The children landed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs, bruised but largely unharmed. Above them, the sounds of destruction continued, wood splintering, glass shattering, the inhuman screams of the entity as it fought against its dissolution. "We have to get out!" James shouted, pulling his sisters to their feet. "The whole house could come down!" "But Mother and Father," Catherine protested, staring up at the attic door. "We can't help them if we're dead too." James grabbed her arm. "Father gave us a chance. We have to take it." Tears streaming down her face, Catherine allowed James to pull her toward the stairs to the main floor, Sarah clutched tightly in her other hand. As they descended, the noises from the attic grew more frenzied, and the entire house seemed to groan and shift beneath their feet. They burst out the front door into the snow-covered yard, just as a massive explosion ripped through the upper story of the house. The force of it knocked them forward onto the ground. Rolling over, they watched in horror and awe as the attic erupted in flames that seemed to burn in impossible colors, not just orange and red, but blue, green, and a deep purple that hurt the eyes. "Mother, Father," Sarah sobbed, reaching toward the burning house. Catherine pulled her close, shielding her sister's eyes from the terrible sight. "They saved us," she whispered, her own tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold. "They chose to save us." As they watched, a dark mass rose from the flames. The shadow entity, but diminished now, tattered and dissolving at the edges. It writhed against the night sky as if in unbearable pain, stretching thinner and thinner until, with a final shriek that echoed across the snow-covered landscape, it tore apart and dissipated into nothing. In the sudden silence that followed, a new sound emerged. Coughing and stumbling footsteps. From the front door of the burning house, 3 figures emerged. Eleanor, supported by Thomas, with Mr. Henderson staggering behind them. "Mother! Father!" The children raced toward them, unable to believe their eyes. Thomas's right hand and arm were badly burned, and all 3 adults were covered in soot and suffering from smoke inhalation. But they were alive, and themselves again. "How?" Catherine asked as she embraced her mother. "We saw the explosion." "The binding was broken," Thomas said weakly, his voice rough from smoke. "When my blood touched the flame willingly, not taken by force or trickery, it reversed the ritual. The entity couldn't maintain its hold." "The fire." James looked back at the house, where the attic was now fully engulfed in natural flames. "We need to get away from here," Thomas urged. "That fire will spread." "What about the others?" Catherine asked. "The other 2 people in the attic." A shadow passed over Thomas's face. "They've been dead for years, Catherine, just empty vessels the entity was using. Former owners, I think, who never escaped its influence." They made their way to the road, supporting each other through the snow. As they reached the Hendersons' wagon, which Mr. Henderson had left tied at the edge of their property, they turned for one last look at the house. The entire structure was ablaze now, the fire spreading with unnatural speed. Yet as they watched, the flames seemed to focus inward rather than outward, consuming the house while leaving the surrounding trees untouched by even a spark. "It's burning itself," Eleanor murmured in wonder. "Cleansing the ground." As they watched, something rose from the heart of the fire. Not the shadow entity this time, but something luminous and peaceful. It hovered briefly above the burning house before separating into multiple glowing forms that drifted upward into the night sky. "The souls it trapped," Thomas said softly, "finally free." They stood in silence as the lights ascended, growing smaller until they were indistinguishable from the stars above. Then, with nothing left to say, they climbed into the Hendersons' wagon and turned toward town, leaving behind the smoldering remains of a house that had never truly been their home. In the weeks that followed, the Willows family's story spread through Boise like wildfire, growing more distorted with each telling. Some claimed the house had been struck by lightning, others that a coal oil lamp had overturned. A few whispered of darker things, curses and hauntings and blood sacrifice, but such tales were dismissed by respectable citizens as superstitious nonsense. The sheriff investigated the fire and the disappearance of Thomas's wagon, eventually concluding that the vehicle had been stolen by drifters who had also attempted to rob the empty house, accidentally setting it ablaze in the process. It was a neat, rational explanation that satisfied most people's need for order in the world. The Willows never corrected these stories. They accepted the community's support and sympathy as they rebuilt their lives, Thomas using the insurance money to open a new store in a different part of town. They found a new home, smaller but warmer somehow, and filled it with light at every opportunity. No shadows were allowed to linger too long in corners. No room was ever left in total darkness. Catherine kept her own counsel about what had really happened that winter, speaking of it only with her family, who shared the burden of the knowledge. Sometimes she would catch Sarah staring into candle flames with a wary fascination, or notice James avoiding certain buildings in town where the shadows fell just so, and she understood, because she did the same. Years later, when Catherine was grown with children of her own, she returned to the site where their house had stood. The land had never been rebuilt upon, though the city had grown around it. Wild grasses and flowers covered the ground where once the binding flame had burned, and birds nested in the trees that had somehow survived the fire. There was peace there now, she realized as she stood at the edge of the property. The kind of peace that comes after long suffering has ended, after justice, or something like it, has finally been served. As she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a small flame dancing among the tall grasses where the house's foundation had once been. Her heart skipped a beat, old fears resurfacing instantly. But as she watched, the flame took shape, forming not into a face twisted with rage and hunger, but into the gentle, smiling countenance of a native woman dressed in traditional garb. The figure bowed slightly to Catherine, a gesture of respect and gratitude, before dissolving into sparks that rose toward the sky. Catherine smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "You're welcome," she whispered to the empty air. Then she walked back to her waiting family, leaving the past and its ghosts finally at rest.